Hello. Thanks for coming. When we were planning this program, we decided it really would be nice this month also to have somebody who lived fairly close to Parker in case the weather got bad. So I was hoping the weather would be nice, but maybe not too nice, because you know, if it's nice, you might get a lot of people, but if it's too nice, it might be like the Super Bowl. I might be talking to myself. So thanks for coming, because it really is a beautiful day out there. We are just feet away from a potential train wreck, at least if it was 62 years ago, because the railroad, the Denver-New Orleans, went right through this library. And fortunately today we have a couple of guys who remember when the rails were still there. We have Jess Mann and Harry Jackson. If you guys would stand, we'd love to see you. I feel terribly underdressed. And that's a good thing. We need to take just a moment for some technical adjustments here so that we can put some lavalier microphones around the necks of these two individuals. I feel very fortunate that we have this program professionally videotaped and audio taped for posterity. It was 62 years ago this year that the last trains ran through town. Basically, a flood in 1935 finished the track off south of ELBERT. And these gentlemen worked on the railroad in its final years.
Last time we had
Jess's dad was also
put
the big cheese here in the Parker area. He was the section foreman?
That's right. President of the school board. My mother was janitor of the school and custodian and the cook. And I was a man about town. See, I've been a man all my life.
You skipped that whole early thing. Now, did both of you work as section men?
I did.
Okay. Would you mind standing up? And I have some tools to show you and see if you can tell us what they're good for.
Well, this is a spike ball. And that's what they use to drive the spikes in the ties. When they take out a tie, they'd have to pull a new tie and dig out the old tie and put a new tie in and put tie plates on the ties, which they didn't use at the time we're talking about now. So consequences was, years later, they took tie plates and off the main line and shipped them on the branch lines, which Parker, the old line this is called, was one of them. And I think if you'd go out in some of these cuts where the railroad used to run, you'd probably find several mineral deposits, because instead of putting the tie plates under the rail like we should, we buried them, because we had to put so many on a day, like 500 a day. So you're going to find a gold mine there.
When did you guys start work? Was it very early in the morning?
I started work as well. When I never worked on the section in Parker. I was a trainman then. But we used to start at 7 o'clock in the morning in the summer and 8 o'clock in the morning in the winter months. If you had a job in the winter months, they usually cut us all off.
Harry, you worked as a Gandy dancer in
Yes.
the Parker area. What time did you start work in the morning?
We had an easy job. It's only 8 to 10 hours is all.
Oh, is that all?
That's all.
8 to 10 hours.
See, on the farm it was can to can't. You know what that means?
No.
You start when you can see and you quit when you can't.
It was can to can't, you said.
Yeah.
Start when you can see and you finish when you can.
And on the railroad it was the best paying job and the least hours.
So you must have really hated the summer when you were up at 5:30 and just about 9:15 they let you get off at night, huh? Where did the Parker section begin? Each railroad had section gangs, and they worked certain sections of a rail line. Where did the Parker section begin, and where did it end?
His father would know exactly. You remember, Jess?
Yeah, when my dad first came to Parker, that was in 1920, the sections were 12 miles long. And his section was from milepost, I think milepost 11 to milepost, no, they changed it. Yeah, 11 to 23 when he first came. After we were here a few years, they lengthened them out to 18 miles long. And a few years after, it was 24 miles long. And long toward the last, there was nothing. The whole thing was one section.
That's a standard.
Parker, by the way, was at milepost 23 on the railroad, and Pueblo is at 124, and 0 is Denver Union Depot. These are tie plates. These were pretty rare out on at least by the 1930s, unimportant line like the one through Parker. although they did have some. Did you install
Yes,
some of
yes.
these on the line?
You bet. You
Now,
bet.
on a line like this, are you able to stand up for this, Harry?
Yeah, if you come over and help me, I'd help. No.
Whoa.
Help himself, he has for years.
We have a tie plate, and Harry installed some of the ones when this line was installing some tie plates in the...
You put them in this side. See this little rib? You knock that up to the base of the rail. So you put it in from the outside in. And these square holes, that's for the square spikes. Have you got any of those square spikes?
you know, you would think that with all the spikes that I have that I could dig one up.
I have
By the
some
way,
spikes.
that's a standard maul.
That's a standard maul that
Yeah.
we saw a few minutes
Yeah,
ago.
the one with the large end, the small, that's a bell maul.
Mm-hmm.
But you can hit your leg with either one of them. You can.
It's a good thing we have two kneecaps. I found this in the Parker Yards years ago. This is not a spike.
No.
Can you tell folks what that is?
Is this a new type of handcuff?
Yeah.
Jess and I knew the old
There's
kind.
no escape.
This is a bolt.
Or he says that's a track bolt.
That's almost as old as I am. Gosh.
That was found in the Parker Yards a few years ago. Now those were used for rail joiners, weren't
No,
they?
not this type of
I
Not
one.
that type?
This is what they call a frog bolt.
That's what they...
And a frog bolt on a turnout on the railroad is where you leave the main line to go in the siding. You have to have a frog which diverts the flange direction or the wheel direction. In other words, if you pull up and back in someplace, there's a guardrail there, the switch is thrown for the track you're backing in on. This frog will split the direction you're going, providing the guardrails on. Sometimes they come off and you go down the middle, you're off the track.
Well, that explains that where I found this was pretty close to where it would have been, and that was the siding over by Mountain Man Fruit and Nut Company where the rail yards were. And for those who aren't aware, portions of the rail yards are still visible. For now, you can still see part of the railroad water tank over by the trees over by Mountain Man. And I have some pictures that I'll be showing later of that.
For a
I'll
while.
tell them something else about this tie plate. You see that tie plate has 4 holes in it. And there's a hole that's offset. And the reason they punched those holes, and they did this on the railroad shop, is because different size rails have different size bases. And the base of the rail is the part that fits on this. That's what they call a repunch tie plate.
For standard rail and
No, repunch. It's for different weights of rail.
technical.
It looks like that first bunch of holes, which is the furthest holes apart, are for 85-pound rails. And the inside looks like about a 65 or 70-pound rail. And the rail is weighed by the yard.
Keep it from
If
skidding.
you have a 90-pound rail, you have 90 pounds per yard.
Now the backs of these have ridges on them. What were the ridges for?
To keep it when it's nailed, to keep it from skidding on the tie.
So this is to keep these from sliding along the relatively smooth surface of the ties.
Yeah.
It kind of bites into
Yeah,
it.
that's right. When you
Okay.
drive the spikes in, and the spikes had a flange on them that went over the base of the rail.
I have some spikes out in the car if you want me to go get them, different kinds.
Sure.
Shall I go now?
Oh, no, we can do that afterwards. And lastly, among the show and tell exhibits is a switch stand broom, which you use for cleaning the line. Now, when you used to work on the railroad, did you ever have to get out and chop some ice out of a switch and brush it off?
Well, we did until we got accused of infringing on the section men's work, and so we let them do it, which was a godsend because sometimes the snow was 6 or 8 or 10 feet deep on the old line. I've made a couple trips out here in train service. And on the main line, which went up to Cheyenne, I worked between Denver and Cheyenne, and also on the narrow gauges, that's where we had a lot of ice. Yes, you use that to sweep the snow out of the switch stands. You use that ice scud on the other end to chip the ice out so you can throw the switch points.
I find this very useful at home, too, in the front porch. That's why it's broken. They tend to get brittle over the years. Fortunately, this wasn't a terribly valuable one that would have come off this line. You'll hear these gentlemen make references to the old line. They are talking about the Colorado and Southern Falcon branch, which was once the Denver New Orleans that went through this town. I have some slides to show, and I'd sure like to have you, when you see something of interest, make some comments.
Okay.
And anyone in the audience who has any particular memories or questions for either them or myself. I'll do the best I can with it. I researched it, but I didn't live it, so there's a lot of dimensions of this subject that I expect to learn today, too.
I have some spikes in my automobile, and I have a few pictures, and I was looking for a 1908 time card, but I've mislaid it somewhere.
Maybe we can get some of that stuff after the show.
And I also have my uniform cap that you told me to wear, but I forgot to bring that too. It's out in the car. And what else do I have? I have a conductor's lantern, this hay burner you have here, and that's what the nickname was, hay burners.
Where did I do with that?
Over here. That's just a regular hay burner, that's kerosene light. When they first came out, they have a fountain at the bottom of them. And the fountain was just a naked fountain, didn't have nothing in it. Later on, they put cotton in there so that kerosene would soak the cotton, and you wouldn't get oil all over your clothes. You fill them just like you did a kerosene light. This is a particular old one because it had a pear-shaped globe on it. The ones I have an oval globe. That was used to give signals with, if you could keep it lit.
Now, did you retire before the age of the Burlington Northern crew packs?
I suppose I did.
The Colorado and Southern, which ran through here, eventually was acquired by the Burlington Northern. And what year did you retire from the railroad?
I retired in 1978. Started in 1933.
Johanna Harden hands some of these packets out to some of us rail buffs, occasionally along with some of her wonderful ginger cookies. And so it was great to receive the Burlington Northern Crew Pack, which doesn't only include some all-purpose cleaners, but it has a list of locomotive malfunctions and electrical, air compressor, trucks, as in wheels, things that you have to check. And a grime-free antiseptic skin cleaner. Did you have that in the old days out here on the railroad?
That was out of style when I was railroading because they give you a bucket of water in a wash pan and you wash your hands in sand or whatever it be and towels. You usually use this.
So much for the moist towelette.
By the way,
they call that progress.
And by the way, while you're at it, I have a water bucket that's used on the railroad too out in the car. It's a special kind. And in case you don't know all about it, I'll show you what it's made like.
Okay. Well, sounds good. We're going to show some slides here. And I guess you'll probably want to sit, but if you see something that you'd like to talk about, and I'll ask you some questions, perhaps you could stand and face the audience and talk about what you see on the slide screen.
Okay.
I might have to have you scoot over a little too because you're sitting over by the screen. So we'll fire up the slide projector
You don't
here.
want to spoil the picture, and let's get over this way.
If we could have our lighting director take care of that task. If we could have our lighting director take care of that task. Thanks.
See, I should be on this side, shouldn't I?
This is a painting that shows up on
Thank
the
you.
cover of the Denver New Orleans book. Photos of this line in the early days are very rare. And so we put a locomotive out on the Colorado Springs branch,
Yeah.
89 miles south of Denver. That's number 6, which is one of the first locomotives bought by the railroad. It shows the area that the railroad covered just prior to the railroad's arrival, starting in Denver. You can see, maybe you can't see, especially if you're in the back, that there were a lot of rivers and watersheds that this railroad had to cross over, which included Cherry Creek, Running Creek, and several others along the way to Pueblo, and it followed Fountain Creek from Fountain south to Pueblo. This was the area covered by the Denver New Orleans, which later became the Colorado and Southern. It had a 9-mile branch line to Colorado Springs, which broke off from a place known as Manitou Junction. They also had some coal business in a place called Franceville, just south of there. That was a 4-mile branch line. This is one of the early timetables. At first, they only ran a couple of trains a day on the line. It was only a Denver to Pueblo rail line. They announced fast trains daily. Yeah, 20 miles an hour. There were a lot of bridges on this rail line, almost 200 in 124 miles. There were a lot of curves, almost a third of the rail between Denver and Easton Ville, 64 miles south, were curves. And I bet that was fun to maintain, wasn't it, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure was.
Rail tends to wear out a lot faster on curves. So we'll start at Denver Union Depot. This is circa about 1915 here. That's a postcard view of where all the action begins. This was one of the early invites to ride on the train. This is the construction camp at Easton Ville, 64 miles south of Denver. Parker, again, is at milepost 23. Easton Ville is at milepost 64. They have some tents set up there. The section house is on your right, and the town is just starting to spring up at this location. Easton Ville actually started about 7 miles in kind of a northwesterly direction, but when the railroad came through, they decided that, yeah, it'd be really nice to have rail service, so they moved to the area. At least some people did. South of there was a place called Manitou Junction. What's now known as Falcon is halfway between Manitou Junction and Easton Ville. Now, the railroad took kind of an interesting route into Colorado Springs. They actually went through the north edge of a cemetery. The road that you see off at the right is the former rail line, which is now a road. Thanks to growth in the Springs area, the cemetery since then has taken over on the north side as well. Then they went into Colorado Springs on Merino Avenue, right through the middle of the street, a decision that some of the people who live along Merino Avenue later learned to regret. You know, railroads in those days, in 1881 and 82, towns really wanted them. The more railroads, the better. But later they decided that they weren't getting any sleep at night. It'd be nice if the railroad was somewhere else. Railroad went west on Merino Avenue and then turned sharp north on Saguache. Until recently, some of that track was still in use.
I might add that noise in Colorado Springs was abolished when they passed the law that the whistles on locomotives cannot be blown within the city limits.
We can thank Colorado Springs for that?
That's right.
This is before there were 500,000 people there. Coal was a pretty important business early on for the railroad at its location out east of Colorado Springs, where there was coal mined in Franceville. Wasn't really good coal, though. It was a fair grade coal. We're out east of Colorado Springs in this very early picture. Not a lot of photographers went out here and took pictures, so we're very grateful for the ones that we do have. Oil was another business that started up in the early 1890s. The oil was actually pumped out in Florence and piped 30 miles east to the rail site just north of Pueblo at a place known as Overton. This only lasted a few years, and then Continental, the all-powerful oil company, basically ran them out of business in a price war.
That's the right, Grand Depot would be.
And after that, the price of kerosene went from 10 cents to 51 cents. This is the southern end of the line at Pueblo Union
I've
Depot.
never seen that.
A depot that's still there, and in my opinion, the most beautiful depot that we have still standing in the state. There's always competition, and the Denver and Rio Grande and the Santa Fe and the Union Pacific were competition for this railroad. Ultimately, after a number of bankruptcies and reorganizations, the Colorado and Southern came about in 1898, and in 1899 they took over. So Parker's Railroad now had another name. It had 6 names over its life. 1899, the Colorado and Southern, which took over the railroad through Parker, acquired trackage rights on the Santa Fe, which still goes through Monument and Castle Rock. And what that did essentially was make this curvy, bridge-filled line from Denver to Pueblo via Parker a secondary line. It was nowhere near as important as it had been before, and only a couple of trains a day ran on it. The track started to fall apart despite the valiant efforts of the understaffed track gangs out here, and not much money was put into this line as it became a low priority. People started calling the railroad Polliwog sometime around the turn of the century. We're still trying to find out exactly what Polliwog means. If anybody out here can help us, that's great. The theory is that like a polliwog, the trains kind of wiggled along slowly as they made their way between Denver and Pueblo.
I think a good name, too, for that would be clickety-clack, because they had a lot of lateral motion in those engines. You could hear the driver's side rods on the driver's hammering. Keep you awake at night.
Did the trains really rock back and forth as the track was in pretty poor shape when you worked?
There has to be play in the driver between the bearing on the journal and the frame of the engine. If you did, you couldn't go around curves. The wheels on all boxcars as well as locomotives were made on a taper. The outside of the wheel had a smaller tire, a smaller part of the tire than the inside. On sharper curves, they were necessary. And on the narrow gauge, they had what they called blind drivers. They didn't have flanges on them at all on the center driver. So you could be going along and three drivers would stay on and one would be flopping up and down on the ties, but they were still moving.
Clyde asked if all the trains were known as Polliwog or just one. It appears as though any train that went out on this line was known as Polliwog, and that includes a gas-powered motor car, which came later in the line's history.
I'll tell you a joke about not a joke, but a thing that actually happened. When the Northern Pacific Railroad first got their diesel, well, they weren't diesel, they were gas-electric cars then, they run one up the old line here. And they got about halfway between here and Hilltop and couldn't make it. The thing almost burned up and got so hot, so they had to wait for it to cool off and back down. By the time they got down the hill, it was so hot they had to send a machinist out of Denver, which were very few and far between, to get the thing running again so to get it back to town.
It was much cheaper to run a gas-powered motor car once business had really declined on this railroad. So what they would do was they would take a steam train out a couple of times a week when there were cars of empties or loads that were coming out on the line. But there were a lot of days there wasn't much going on, and in the old days railroads would haul anything for you. If you just had a few little items that you wanted to send to your friend in ELBERT or something, you could load them on the train, and they were called less than carload materials. And you just give them a few bucks, they'd send it out for you, and you'd pick it up at the depot in ELBERT, for instance. So when these gas-powered motor cars went into service, it saved a lot of money because you didn't have the engineer, the fireman, the coal, the water, everything you had to deal with the steam locomotives, which were expensive to keep up. We have a question.
That film right there shows 3 rails. Do they have narrow gauge in here as well?
We have 3 rails in this photograph because this was taken in Denver.
The old line didn't have 3 rails, but the main line between Denver and Pueblo did. The reason you see the 3 rails on there is on account of the narrow gauge and the standard gauge. They used to use standard gauge engines to switch narrow gauge cars or vice versa. At Leadville, when it was narrow gauge, they had what they called a 3-way coupler. The coupler wasn't mounted to the frame like they are nowadays, or like they were, but they had a casting made so you slipped from side to side. Then they had a lead. For instance, you wanted to change that 3rd rail from one side to the other, they had what they call a lead. And that was only a half of the frog, so you could divert itself and it'd slide back and forth in its slot. For years I had one at Leadville, and it was off the ground most of the time because it was made out of wood bridge timber.
For many years, the Colorado and Southern Railway also had to carry the weight of an antiquated narrow gauge system, which was very colorful, and I love the narrow gauge, but by the 1930s it was a real money loser for the rail line. So the Colorado and Southern, in many places, had to have these 3 rails, like Jess just pointed out, so that you could run either a standard gauge or the narrow gauge would run on the 2 rails that are closer in together, and we mean the 2 that are wider apart here from the center to your right over there in the picture.
You see that 3rd rail, the distance between the inside rail and the outside rail is 3 foot. That's standard. That's the standard gauge for a narrow gauge, but the standard gauge is 4 foot 8.5. That's the difference in width.
So this is what was affectionately known, or maybe not so affectionately known, as the Polliwog Train, which ran through Parker.
That's engine 312.
You gentlemen have any memories, or anyone else, of these little trains that used to run through town?
Oh, I have a lot of memories. I had an aunt that lived.
We'll be ordering in dinner.
I I had an aunt that lived in Johnstown, Colorado, and at that time they had what they call Lock-homing motor cars, which was run on the Great Western Railroad. So she'd have to get on this car, this motor car, and go over to Longmont, and then she'd take the Polliwog, so you say to Boulder, and catch the D&I cars to Denver, and then catch the old line to
Denver
Parker.
into Urban, yes.
That was about 4 or 5 transfers in less than 60 miles.
Now you get in your car and you're there in an hour and a half if there's no traffic. In later years on this railroad, the trains were very short. The locomotive was very old. This was a 45-year-old locomotive when this picture was taken in the middle 1930s. They ran what they called a mixed train. There's a boxcar, which was a customer's boxcar of business, and then behind that is a combination car, where the 1 or 2 passengers, which this train might get on a typical day, 3 or 4 on a good day by the 1930s, and they also had the mail contract.
I might tell you something about the mail contract. They had these little engines. They were old mainline passenger engines, the 310. They had from the 39 to the 318, I believe it was. They were all passenger runs, passenger trains. Never used them on the Denver, New Orleans, and all up and down the main line into Pueblo and up north. And they were quite the engines. But that's a picture you sent me, and it's taken about Arkansas and about Clarkson. There used to be an oil company just down the other side of that.
Okay, this was taken in the South Denver area near the current site, roughly near the current site of Gates Rubber.
Yeah,
a little south of there.
Arkansas and Clarkson, that'd be a block south of, 2 blocks south of Louisiana, and about 5 or 6 blocks east of, Broadway. And the way they got the cars in on this, it was a spur track, so they had to do what they call make a drop. And a drop is where you cut the car off, bleed the car out so the air won't set on it, and then you go up to the switch and be sure the switch works properly. And he'd take a run, you disconnect the car from the train, and they'd make a run. And they'd give you the slack so you'd get the pin, and the engine would go down the main line, and the brakeman would throw the switch and put the car in the siding. And that used to happen over here on this track on the Continental Oil Company's spur. That siding you called was the business track. And the Continental tank was on the north end, so of course they had to drop the car in there. And I remember one time they forgot to take the D-rail off and ditched the car full of gas. I mean, that was a catastrophe for Parker. No fire department, no nothing else, but there was no fire.
Now the track in Parker, the spur track or siding in Parker, also served the stockyard here in town.
Oh yeah,
And
stockyard.
Burt Hall's Mercantile.
There was a stockyard and then a lumber yard and 2 or 3 merchandise warehouses, and Burt Hall built a new one on the very south end of it. Sometimes they'd drop those cars and they wouldn't be spotted, and they'd try to move them and they'd roll down and never would get them spotted until the train come by, which was about twice a week. That particular engine was sold to the Mount Harris Coal Company, and they junked the engine and used the boiler for their steamworks at Mount Harris.
Once this line was abandoned, these locomotives were so old they wouldn't have run them on any other Colorado and Southern line. It was slow speeds out here, and the trackage wasn't that good, so they kept these locomotives for this line. And once this line was torn out, the locomotives were cut up, with the exception of the one that Jess mentioned, which was sold to, it was a coal company, wasn't it?
Yeah, Mount Harris.
Now this is Schwader Luggage Company, which later became Samsonite. And this is in South Denver. This is also on the rail line on the north end. And they became famous for their Samsonite products. You could buy a card table for $5, and they like to prove how strong they were. You've got the Schwader brothers, and they're on top of that card table. They were, let's find a man who weighs as much as all the Schwader brothers together. They had quite an advertising campaign for Schwader, which became, in later years, definitely one of the most important customers on the line, if not the most important customer. They had all kinds of weights and displays for the Samsonite products. And if all else fails, let's give it the old water torture test. This is in University Park as we leave Denver on the old line through Parker, on our way to Falcon. We go through Sullivan, which is near the site today of Iliff and Quebec. For years after this became part of Denver, people were still seeing the Sullivan Exchange on their phone bills. This is an aerial view of near where today's, well, part of it is where today's Cherry Creek Dam is. It includes the original dam, which was built in 1935, the Kenwood Dam. This picture taken in 1949 shows the old Sullivan Road. I knew there was a reason why I brought this pointer. There's the old Sullivan Road. This would be I-225, right over by the Cherry Creek Dam, and the railroad ran right along it. All that's left now is the spillway, which is covered with graffiti right now, and they have the Kennedy golf course over here. And there's a soccer field and stuff in this area here. This was Kenwood, and this was 12 miles south of Denver. And Melvin was next. We're along Cherry Creek now, and Melvin was a site where a lot of people like to go out to the Arlington Grove picnic area. And trains would make special excursions out to Arlington Grove in the Melvin area for people to spend a nice day under the cottonwoods. They'd have bands out there and they'd picnic and play. This is a view of Melvin. This was a store which had a number of owners. Do some people remember when the store was still around? I've heard tales of it being around in the 30s and people riding horses to
Well,
Denver.
it was there. When they tore up the old line, it was still sitting there. After that, I don't know how long after that it was there. There used to be people by the name of Vowell run it, and he was a sign painter as well as a house painter when he was sober enough to do the painting. He lived in Parkland, by the way.
Anybody remember the days of riding to Denver along the old Sullivan Road from Parker?
Sure, I do. I do.
The round barn? I'm here to learn.
The round barn she's talking about was called the Hope Ranch. It was just a little bit west of the Bellevue Avenue and the Melvin School. Then you went on down toward the Cherry Creek Dam, and there was a place called the Priestry. That's where the priests had a farm. I guess it was really monks then. And across from that was a pump house, an irrigation pump house where they used to pump water on the lowlands of Cherry Creek. That was near, just south of the old Ransfeld place.
For a number of years they had a water tank, and this is how they pumped it with the windmill, and the railroad section house. This was taken about 1895.
That's right. That's before my time, of course.
Melvin School, built in 1922. Sullivan Road, railroad tracks. You can just barely make out, if you're close enough, the cross arms for the crossing over there.
That street right there, where it crosses the railroad, is Bellevue Avenue. If anybody knew Fred Ransfeld, he and his brother and sister went to that school. Maybe you do, I don't know.
And if anyone is interested in joining or learning more about the Cherry Creek Valley Historical Society, we'd sure like to talk with you after the meeting, Clarice or I, or Lee Whiteley, or anyone else who's involved who's here today. This is on Ann and Dean Weaver's property. They don't get the train, and they don't get much of the bridge. There's only a little bit left, which was cut off. Most of the track, most of the bridge, when they tore up the line, they cut off down at the base of the creek. We are heading into Parker, about 1893.
That's Cherry Creek.
And this is over by the rec center, for those who are wondering, over near Lincoln Avenue. There's a bike path there now. This is the 20-mile house as seen from the tracks, and it's approximately where we are now, just about the library site. And 20-mile house. The tracks followed, this would be Lincoln Avenue, say up about here. The railroad ran along Dransfeld Road. It crossed and ran along Dransfeld Road. And here we are at the library. And just north of Main Street, this would be about where the yards are, where Mountain Man is. And then this is where the old library was. And I think it was at the town hall you guys have here. I'm a foreigner. I live in Aurora. Is this where your town hall is?
Yes.
This would be Sulphur Gulch, and the railroad's longest bridge was right here. And portions of that are still to be seen too. Get it while it's hot, before it's not. These are the yards in Parker. Let's see, we have a lumber yard and a siding and the stockyards and the depot, water tank, section house, all in that general area. That map, that's probably the 1913 evaluation when they came through and evaluated the railroad, and we overlaid some things onto that.
Water tank to pump out. Water tank to pump out.
It's not actually behind. It's just east, but it's in that open area there where they sometimes have events and trucks park. And here's the Parker Depot. You gentlemen ever been inside that building?
Sure.
I thought maybe so.
I'll tell you a story about that too. There used to be an old agent by the name of Grissinger, and he lived on that Pikes Peak Road out here, the old Parker Road where we used to turn and go south. He lived in that place. Anyhow, he was quite a tobacconeur, and I was a boy about 9 or 10 years old, and I always went down to see old Griss. That's what we used to call him. And in the olden days, they had a press that they would put the record book in, make copies of the record book, and press it on this paper, and they had to have wet canvases to transfer. Well, he was putting that press together, and he walked out to do something or other, I don't know what it was, and I decided I'd take a slug of that beech nut he always chewed. And boy, that was the last slug I ever chewed.
Does anybody else remember their visits to the Parker Depot? We have Leonard Walden over here from Hilltop, where we'll be visiting next. And what are your memories there, Leonard?
So you're looking east, Tim?
Well, Leonard, there was
Yes.
two places there. There was a depot, and right behind the depot was a two-room house, about the same size as that depot, where the operator, the agent, stayed. At one time at Parker, there was 3 operators, one every 8 hours.
That's right, Tim. What is that?
The house was just about the same size as that depot.
Yeah.
And they were both built. Like I have an old file that gives a blueprint of all the outbuildings and of all the locomotives they had at that time, and dimensions of the boxcars and a little of everything, even the outhouses. They were all built to standard, except at the depot, and that was separated. Had one for the public and one for the private.
The firehouse back up there?
There was no firehouse when we was here, no sign of anything, not even a hose cart out here. If you had a fire, you just let her go, nature took care of it.
But in 1889, when this railroad became part of a line that went all the way to Texas, Parker suddenly became very important because it was at the bottom of a long, long hill. And it's now known as Hilltop Road, and it was a 2%. They climbed 2 feet for every 100 feet to get to Hilltop. And it was very tough on locomotives, and at that point they needed to have a second locomotive kept here to help the train get to the top of the hill, and then it would cut off and come back down.
Well, you want to consider in those days they had those little light engines. They were 240 engines. They had 4 drivers and pony truck, single pony truck, and they were the 140 class. Yeah, the 140 class. No, the 120 class. The 120 class engines were gone before my time, but they had one left, and they made an inspection engine out of that. It had what we used to call a glass engine. It had a glass cage across the front with doors where the officials could sit, the superintendents and the general manager, whoever it was, to inspect the track. But the only thing that the superintendent was usually the engineer on the deal. The only thing he can handle is the straight air on the engine, which is a straight air, just no automatic air on it at all, just straight air. And he handled the throttle, but the fireman had to fire the engine. He had to use a Johnson bar, and every time the engineer whoever was running the engine wanted to back up or go ahead, he'd whistle a regular signal. 3 back up and 2 is go ahead.
So people understand a Johnson bar is kind of like a throttle on a locomotive, isn't
Johnson
it?
bar determines the direction of the engine you're going. If it's on dead center, you can't move the engine. If it's forward, you go forward. If it's backwards, you go backwards. And it had a big lever about like that. We had a big old fat engineer, and I never will forget it. He just about fit between the Johnson bar and the engine. Every time he'd go to throw the arm over, he said, "God damn it, there goes another bruise."
Parker's changed a little bit since this turn of the century picture was taken from the water tank looking west. The depot is located near Mountain Man Fruit and Nut Company. Yeah, in that open area. It's still open, isn't it?
It's set directly in back of the bank. Is that bank, the old bank building, still on the corner of that brick building?
No, it's gone.
Pump house.
It's gone. There used to be a washateria in there. And that washateria is what polluted the water for the water tank. That water, when we lived here, was 98% pure, and the well was 65 feet deep with 35 feet of water.
We'd mentioned earlier on about that track bolt that I found, and the spur track broke off about right here and went along the side of these buildings and then over to the stockyard. This is Hilltop, and I bet Jess can help us on this. There was a collision that took place, for those who can't see it, near a cut in deep snow at the top of the grade near Hilltop on April 15th, 1921. Now, Hilltop is 7 miles southeast of Parker at the end of that very long hill. And the tracks curved through a cut before you got to Hilltop. It breaks off from today's Hilltop Road. Can you tell us anything about this collision? This came from Jess's collection.
Well,
His dad worked for the railroad.
I can't tell you much about it. I happen to know all those old fellas' names on there. There were everybody's pictures on there, yes, from my father's. Anyhow, snow was about 4 feet deep. This accident happened to what they call the 4 mile cut, because the 4 mile ranch was right above that toward Hilltop. They were they took the section men along. If the weather broke, they was going to unload cinders for ballast, but there was about 4 feet of snow, so that shows what kind of management they had then. Anyhow, they was battle the snow, bucking back and forth, and each one of those engines had a wedge plow in the front of it. And of course, the engineer got tired, so he asked my dad if he'd help me throw the Johnson bow over, and he did. And just about the time he threw it over in the forward motion, that's when they struck, and he come home with his eye black, and he didn't have any broken bones, but the wonder he didn't. There's a fellow by the name of Clark, he isn't showing on there, but he kind of lost his memory. And of course, when you had an accident like that, the rear brakeman had to go back and flag the trains. There probably wasn't any coming, but that was the law. And he got lost. They found him. It took him 2 or 3 days to find him, and they finally found him in a place called the Mining House. It still sits up there. He just went in, got warm. He knew there wasn't anything coming, but later on he got fired.
Now at Hilltop, and we have some folks from Hilltop here today, there was a siding, and they didn't actually have a depot like it says here. The store was the depot and a number of other things. You could buy a ticket at this particular depot for the train if necessary. It was part of Adams Express Agency. And there it is.
That's the original. I did not use that building except
It's hard to believe now, but this used to be big cattle country. And in the old days, the railroads were responsible if they hit a cow to pay for it. So railroads quickly learned it was cheaper in the long run to build fences. But still, even though the line was entirely fenced in 1894, in 1895, it looks like engine number 565 killed a cow, a red calf, about 6 months old, not branded, killed by train number 8, engine 565 in the Parker area. Now it's kind of funny because whenever the cattle were hit and the cattle owners made a claim, it was always their best, top, most valuable cattle that got hit. Always. No. Oh, there was a law that required that fences? Larry says there was a law that required that the railroads be fenced off. One of the neat places on the rail line was between Hilltop and Elizabeth, out near the Pawnee Hills Subdivision. This was one of the two horseshoe curves that the rail line had. There are now a number of homes scattered throughout here. This is known as Whiskey Gulch. Yeah. There were a series of bridges in this area crossing over each one of those little gulches. And we get into Elizabeth. This is a 1967 aerial of Elizabeth. You can still follow the rail line at that point through town on the east edge of downtown, but still west of Running Creek. In 1965, the water got a little higher than usual and washed out some portions, as well as other times over the years since 1936 when this track came out. This is an 1885 view on the east side, over near the old Phillips Ranch of Running Creek. And this is the depot. The section house, which still stands, is just out of view. It's an old schoolhouse. The town was just starting to grow, really. This is about 1910, with a mail hack over here, Mr. McCausland's mail hack, and a southbound train at Elizabeth Depot. And this is a northbound train. This guy who took this picture committed one of the ultimate sins of railroad photographers. He cut off the nose. But at least he took the picture. Now the other horseshoe curve was 48 miles south of Denver, about 9 miles south of Elizabeth. If you've ever taken the back road to ELBERT along County Road 17, you perhaps have seen portions of the rail line which are very visible right there. This is known as Cameron. And Cameron School was right down here. And Merle Adams, who lives in Elizabeth, who is not here today, remembered watching trains come down from the school window and occasionally hearing from the teacher about being distracted from studies. He used to like to watch them go down the hill. We're in ELBERT now at milepost 52, 52 miles south of Denver. We're now over along Kiowa Creek. And the rail tracks came down through here and crossed over Kiowa Creek. Here's a train at ELBERT in the 1880s, taken from the hill, just east of downtown, west of downtown. They used to have the ELBERT County Fair there. This is about 1906. This is downtown ELBERT back here, and you can't see it, but there's a train in there. Excursions would come up from Colorado Springs and Denver. The next real town along the line was Easton Ville. Easton Ville was 64 miles south. There's not much left of Easton Ville today. They, in later years, had a Y down there, and I'm going to ask these gentlemen questions about Easton Ville here. They had a Y to turn the train around and go back to Denver if they had no need to go to Falcon that day. And in later years, they only went to Falcon on Sunday.
That Y was used to turn the direction so they go back to Denver, but they also turned it. They went clear to Falcon, backed up and went around the Y, headed to Denver. Next morning, they used to back into Falcon and start from Falcon on down.
Is that right?
The schedule of the train originally starts at Falcon.
Yep.
Easton Ville used to be quite a town. They had a big mercantile company there. And it was a family by the name of Kraxberger that run it. And we had a conductor on the railroad that married one of those Kraxberger girls, and he said they sold everything there. They also had they raised a lot of potatoes at Easton Ville. They had maybe 4 or 5 cars of potatoes a week out of there. Now, that don't sound possible. They were dry land potatoes. That was quite a town, Easton Ville, and I might add that when they tore the track up, the bridge of Squirrel over Squirrel Creek was washed almost completely out, everything but the ties and the rails. So I was cut off in train service, and I went down there to run the rail machine, and the roadmaster said, "Would you mind taking this rail machine over that washed out bridge?" And I said, "Well, I'll try it." I was about 20 years old, maybe 18, 19. And I went over there, and the rail was just like that. But we made it across there. We set up camp. There was a railroad well at Easton Ville, and by the way, the section foreman there raised pet skunks. And of course, he took the perfume away from them. I never will forget that, though. That was something. We pumped this well, had a lot of nice, clean water. We'd been drinking it for a couple of days, and all of a sudden, we decided we'd have to have some more water, so we started pumping again. And what do you suppose come out of the well? Salamanders, just bucket after bucket of them. I found out afterwards, though, they purified the water, but I don't think so.
Depending on where I give a program like this, I have to be careful about mentioning my favorite town along the line. Of course, it's Parker. I have to admit Eastonville is one of my favorites, perhaps because it's a ghost town, but there were a lot of interesting stories that showed up in the old newspapers out there of cattlemen getting in fights and drunken brawls and all kinds of crazy shenanigans going on. This was a real shipping point at one point. They had sheep and cattle, what you see going here. I think it's sheep in this picture. And And as Jess had mentioned, potatoes were big, but one of the problems with potatoes was there was blight out there.
Yeah.
And it was very unpredictable. It was not something that you could count on. Falcon was the end of the line by the time these gentlemen were working for the railroad. It was 73 miles south of Denver. So over the years, the tracks gradually came up between Pueblo and Falcon. This is where the Colorado and Southern came in from the north, and they had the Y for turning the locomotives around and going back to Denver. They also had the interchange track, which Jess mentioned, where they connected with the Rock Island, which went to Colorado Springs, and they went to Lyman. Here's the depot. The Colorado and Southern line is right about here and comes in the Y, and then here's the depot, which was used by both railroads but owned by the Rock Island. That was very common out here in the fairly flat areas, that the highest point in town would be the railroad water tank. This was the Elsner's and Brown's store, known as the ELBERT Cash Store. Sheriff Roy Brown, who some of you may well remember, he was a famous local celebrity for years, and he knew how to perhaps do the best barbecues anywhere in these three county areas, El Paso and Douglas and Arapahoe. So he was always popular and always invited to the barbecues, and he brought his chef's hat. Here is the Stockyards at ELBERT, just north of town. This is the Stockyards at Falcon. There's Roy Brown on your left and Roy Standish on your right at the Denver Union Stockyards, which was the destination of the stock trains that ran through Parker. There was also lumber. This is out on Boot Ranch, south of Elizabeth. And ties that were cut and stacked up at Easton Ville from the Billy Paul Ranch. I think there's two boots. There's an upper and a lower boot ranch. Thank you. I wish the Adamses were here to save me because they owned it and they had it in their family for years. Digging potatoes, smoking a pipe. Potatoes. We're in Parker, believe it or not, in 1913 when there was a lot of snow clearing activity, quite the blizzard that year. The line was shut down for a week. We're up near Hilltop. They've probably just gone through the cut. We're coming back from Hilltop, I should say. This is Elizabeth. They stop. This is the rotary snow plow. It kind of turns like a fan and throws the snow.
I might add that the sisters of that snow plow is the one that's at the Railroad Museum of Golden. The C&S had two of them.
As Jess said, for those who missed it, that particular rotary snow plow, well, actually its sister, is on display at the Colorado Railroad Museum right across the road from the museum. It looks a little different now, but it's still around. We're in ELBERT now. Down near Easton Ville. This brought out the photographers, I've noticed, more than anything, snow. And that's a close-up of the wreck at Hilltop that we mentioned earlier. I came from Jess's collection. Does anyone recognize these people?
Is that Wilbur Step? His wife?
Besides the fact that they're backwards, they still look about the same. These were the Steps. Yes, that's right, the Steps, soon after they had gotten married.
I see that Hazel Step recently passed away.
And so did Wilbur.
Wilbur
Yeah.
used to work for my father on the section when he was a young fellow.
You remember Wilbur when he
Oh,
worked for the
sure, I
railroad?
know Hazel. I see there was Helen, Hazel, Virgie, and Freddie,
The Gradall family.
the Radall family. And they lived right up this direction. I believe it is now. I don't know for sure.
Mhm.
Ed Loop had a house up there, and he was a town jeweler. Maybe some of you folks remember him. He was somewhat related to the Shadows. He was from Switzerland, and he showed me one time a clock that he'd made out of wood. The only thing that was metal was the spring in it. All the rest was wood. That was part of his training in Switzerland.
He was a good musician, too. She was a good cook, and
Yeah.
she used to cook
Oh,
for
she
the
was a
railroad
wonderful
guys
cook.
sometimes.
And I might add that up on top of the hill in back of that house was a place called the Fogel House, and that's the first pre-cut house built in this area. It was made by the Aladdin Homes. And everybody went up there. That was quite a sight to see. They sold quite a few houses like that out here. But Fogel's the first one that had it. That's the glass engine right there. I think it's a 134 or something like that. But that's it. Of course, that fella in the window is the pilot, but he...
That's a track inspection locomotive,
Yeah,
so you can get down low.
That's the glass engine.
Yep, the glass engine.
I might add that the drawbars are coupling on the front and back of each car. That one had what they call an old Lincoln pin knuckle in it. You notice some of these old cars in the museum or something have a slot cut in the knuckle? Well, that's so they could use Lincoln pin or a knuckle type coupler. I have a Lincoln pin for that particular coupler, and that was for the engines. And I have one for the cars at home.
You'd inspect the rails, or on this line, you'd inspect the weeds.
Well, I'll tell you a joke about the weed burner. In modern days, they had one that was run with gasoline power, and it was real, had a tank and everything. In the olden days, they'd take a tender off a little locomotive, and they'd put a great big metal box in front of it and fill that full of fire brick, and then they had the tank where the water was full of distillate or kerosene. And they'd start this out. They had to have a crew for all this, of course. And they couldn't shut it off over the bridges, so they had a metal plate they put under it. Every bridge you come to or anywhere you might catch a fire, they put this plate under it. They never put the fire out. And lots of times the bridges would catch on fire, and that was quite a job for the section men. But there was an old Swede fellow, the assistant roadmaster, and he thought quite a bit of my mother, and we always raised chickens out here at Parker. He said, you know, Mrs. Mann, I like to have chickens. He said, I'm sure hungry. He said, that sure does taste good. That's the best tasting chicken I ever fried. And he never flew fried it, my mother did. Once in a while, these robbers, trainmen and enginemen would steal some of her fried chicken, then they'd have the nerve to come back and tell her how nice the chicken was.
Harry Jackson, you worked as a Gandy dancer. How long would it take you to put the Parker Railroad back in service again when something like this happened? Take a look at that rail. It's not where it's supposed to be, is it?
I think I should explain right now that you notice I'm the quiet one of the two.
We've noticed.
See, Jess's father was a section boss on the railroad, and Jess retired from the railroad. How many years was you on it?
I worked for him 45 years.
Well, he was with them 45 years.
I worked 4 years on the
I
railroad.
didn't add what he said. And I was only on the section as a Gandy dancer for 3 summers. But I can tell you when I started, and some of you people might know who my partner was that taught me how to swing that funny looking thing over there called a spike maul. It's Pete Sanchez. He even taught me how to swear in Spanish. And the reason he taught me that is because he hurt himself one day. He missed the spike and hit himself, and he swore in Spanish, but it seemed to help him out. So I remembered exactly what he said, because one of these days I hurt myself, and I repeated it, and he said, "You're the dirtiest talking man I ever heard." So I never asked him what I was saying, because it made me feel better though. But anyway, I'll tell you this about the train that run out there. There's very accommodating, very accommodating. There's farmers out there a lot. And one time I heard that there's a farmer, the train was stopped, and this farmer went over and said, "I would ship eggs with you today, but we only got 10 eggs. And I know that you have to have 12 before you can ship." The conductor, was it your father or who was it, said, "That's okay, we'll wait." So that's why I'm not much help on the railroad. And another thing, I got to tell you the way I was hired. Mr. Lehman was the section boss after Jess's father was out there. And at that time, it was a depression. And of course, a lot of you kids remember that. And I walked up behind this group of fellows standing in line, and Mr. Lehman had his glasses down on his nose, and he'd look at you this way and then write the name and so on. When I come up, he said, "How old are you, sir?" I said, "I'm 21, sir." And you wasn't supposed to work on the section that way because until you was 21. He reached over and he felt on my chin and he said, "You got the smoothest chin for any 21-year-old. I was 14. I was 14. He said, I can't call you a liar. Come in the morning. So I was 17 when the last summer I worked there, only 3. And if you notice, he's the noisy one in the group, and I'm the quiet one, so I'll turn it back over to him. Thank you.
When you talk
That was a
about how long
washout
it would
in
take
Parker.
to fix that washout, what they used to do, the Colorado Southern had quite an ore business from Sunrise, Wyoming to Pueblo, to the Dominican Works. If there was an ore train in Denver when that particular washout would happen, what happened, they'd take all the engine would pull out there, and they'd fill that up with red ore. They'd dump it on the dry land and take a team or whatever they happen to have and shove it down in the hole. That's how they done it, and then haul out cinders, put the track on. I imagine if you dug up some of these bridge abutments, you'd find a lot of red ore, or a lot of places. There used to be quite a bit of washout between Denver and Hilltop. I mean, between Parker and Hilltop, and especially down here in the Cherry Creek Valley.
You know, it's hard to believe that men who had your positions with the railroad, didn't wear some kind of true head protection. Look at these hard hats, quote unquote, that these guys used when they worked as section guys.
Yeah, those hats aren't near as hard as that handlebar you see. That's a push car. I mean a hand car. That's the one that's up and down, up and down.
Now this replaced the up and down cars.
That's a Fairmont. That's what they call an old Fairmont. That's a Fairmont Motor Car. It had a 2-cycle engine on it, burnt a mix of gas, and the only way to reverse the motor, because it had a belt that drove the wheels, and the only way you do is throw it out, loosen the belt, and then you stop the motor, just about stop it, and you throw the spark control over, and that would reverse the direction of the engine if you caught it just right. It's just like reversing any old gas engine. You can do it on any of them, but that's what happened to that one. There's no valves. It was a port motor.
From the Anna Rowley collection, we're fortunate also in the book to have these photos of them actually rebuilding a bridge after sections of it had washed out. This is the bridge over near Lincoln Avenue, the Cherry Creek crossing of the railroad, when they had to put in new pilings. They had to actually push them into the bed of the creek, and that's what they're doing here. This is what replaced the steam locomotive several times a week that we talked about. From 1933 to 1935, a couple times a week, this doodlebug, as they called it, ran through Parker. It took care of all the small business and the couple of passengers that might be on the line that day who wanted a ride. Now, essentially what ultimately finished off this line, although it probably would have been abandoned in the 1940s anyway, was a huge flood in May of 1935 in ELBERT, which went down to Kiowa and on to Bennett and so on and so forth. Some of the folks who remember it talk about the walls of water. And there's a wall of water, I'll bet you.
Squirrel Creek. That was Squirrel Creek.
This is ELBERT after the flood. Portions of ELBERT after the flood. Buildings just kind of washed down the creek and just kind of mingled together there on the north side of town, attached to fences. 7 people died in this flood, including the wife of the section house person, Mr. Giesche, Theodore Giesche, in ELBERT. There's the water tank. That's about all that was left of the rail facilities there. The tracks are entirely gone. Just a lot of sand right there. This was the last train out of ELBERT and through Parker, not including the scrap trains. July 3rd, 1936. At the bottom it says, this concludes the operations of trains on the Falcon Subdivision, account of the line being abandoned. Now, Jess, you can tell us about this. After they stopped running trains on the line, they started preparing to tear up the tracks. Now, so much of the track was gone south of ELBERT, they actually used Gallagher Transfer Trucking Company to pick up the rail along the line and take it to ELBERT, where it was loaded and brought back to Denver. Well, while in the process of doing that, a train of scrap material was switching in Elizabeth when the railroad had its last fatality. We were talking on the phone about this. You remember the man who died, Mr. Charles Kirby.
Charles Kirby was a personal friend of my girlfriend's mother and dad. And by the way, my lady friend at that time was a lady by the name of Betty Knapp. She was a main instructor for the Denver Just Kids Band. I suppose some of you might remember it. She could play any kind of an instrument. Well, anyhow, getting back to this catastrophe, this Kirby was letting a hand, there was a track. I guess this must be the business track where the outfit cars were. Outfit cars, but the gang was tearing it up. And they had to switch the water car out, and the water car at that time consisted of a tender off a locomotive. And the front of that tank would be open where they had the coal. And the brake staff was always on that open end. And that days they didn't have any AER specifications on where the brake would be or what kind it would be. Anyhow, it was a staff brake. That's an iron rod sticking up with a wheel on top and a dog on the bottom to keep the brake set. And as a rule, those cars were all rotten. Well, this one was rotten. The bulkhead on this tank was real rotten. And he went to put the brake on, evidently, set the brake by hand and give it an extra jerk or two with the brake club and fell off. Well, in the meantime, they pulled the cars out and run over him, just cut him all to pieces. They found part of his body. I guess they backed up and forth over him a couple of times before they realized that they killed somebody. It was quite a sight.
In fact, the train crew at first could not find the body.
That's right.
And they went back to Cameron to go get the rest of the cars because they couldn't climb Cameron Hill with all of the heavy scrap train cars they had. So they went to get the rest of them, and they didn't know where he was. The engineer in the report I found at the Railroad Museum said that he couldn't find the man. He thought maybe he'd gone up to the store and got a donut, or maybe gone up and talked to the section men, which doesn't make a lot of sense because he was on duty. Why would he do that? But that was a story that they had. We won't get into details about the gruesomeness of this, but this is where the beginning of the blood was, and B is where the body was found. And it was scattered quite a bit around the yards. And as you can see with the weeds, it's amazed anybody found anything in Elizabeth that day. This is looking towards Parker at the crossing of Highway 86. Another view of the scene in Elizabeth, 1936. This is some of the guys in ELBERT who were hired to work for the railroad to help scrap the line, including Hugh Fawnin, who was interviewed in my book. And he was very young then, and he talked about working for the railroad all summer and into the fall, helping them tear up the tracks. And there they are tearing up the tracks in the summer of 1936.
Getting back to the other picture, I think that one was Emery LaRue, if anybody remembers Emery. It kind of looked like him anyhow. He used to work for Barney Beard at the hardware store and drove the Beard Truck Company from Denver to Parker.
They lift up the rail, take out the ties, cut off the bridge, bottoms of the bridges.
Now that rail machine is the one I run. The other one is the new one they bought after we junked this one.
Is this a spike puller?
No, that's a rail machine. There's a manual boom that comes right off of here, fastened up there with a cable. And that's all there was. There was a cone clutch in that thing, and once in a while the cone clutch gets to slipping and you have a runaway because that's all the brakes you had on it.
This is them tearing up the bridge that crossed Cherry Creek just north of Parker on the Weaver's property.
That machine you see there, that crane, that's what they call a burro. That was the name of the machine, the burro.
When the tracks were taken up out of Parker, they didn't take them all the way back to Denver Union Station. Instead, they tore them up as far as a place called Connors, which isn't really a town, it's just a location where they had a mill and they had a great western sugar beet dump. Connors is near the present site of Hawley and Evans in Denver, and until 2 years ago, this was still there. It was later a restaurant, and our restaurant liquidators and a bunch of other things. This was the end of track. So when they didn't run through Parker anymore, they ran fancier locomotives out on the small portion that was still left, like number 638. I like the Mercury on the left there, too. I looked it up in my book, and it's a 58, they say. This is a 1962 excursion out on Connor Spur, as the line was then known, and what was left of it. This is the kind of locomotives they ran. A little chunkier than the ones that ran through Parker. This is along Bucktail Boulevard. We ran an excursion out there, football excursions periodically. High school teams would play out at the DU Stadium, and they would run them out there on the train.
During World War II, they took trainees out to DU. They ran several specials out there as far as a place called Elmer. That's where University Boulevard is now.
This is at South Denver. Montgomery Ward is on your left. This is a view of the excursion that day in May of 1962. Now, this is probably a familiar bridge to a lot of folks who probably sat in traffic.
That's right in my home.
But have you ever
That's
seen
my
this on
territory.
top of it? 1969, Hall Wagner snapped this picture of a train that was going out to Connors.
That's about it.
And I snapped this picture just before this railroad was taken out across South Broadway when they still went out to Gates. They stopped doing that in October of 1993. And they were only doing it about once a month. And the Union, or rather the Burlington Northern, I think probably got real tired of getting my phone calls several times a day. When's that train running out there to South Broadway?
They don't know when it's
But boy, it was worth getting. This is one of the things that are left of this railroad, like the lock, the old Denver-New Orleans lock. You can still find things like this for the railroad. Basically, this is my what's left section as we finish up. An old ticket from Little Buttes down near Fountain to Denver in 1899, just before they stopped running on that southern end of the track. There's a Denver and Colorado Springs Railway Post Office mark. That was the mail stamp they gave on the trains that ran through Parker, and a northbound.
If you notice on that stamp, it says at the bottom of it, RPO, that stands for Railroad Post Office. That was when they had the sorting car on the train.
And of course there's photographs of the trains that ran through Parker, some. And a few little odds and ends left, the old crossing post for the cross bucks at Colorado Boulevard. That's still there. The last train ran over this bridge in 1979. This is in Parker area, just north of town, over by Lincoln. This is what's left of that Cherry Creek bridge trestle we were talking about. This is the water tank. It's a nice sunny day. If you want to go over and check it out, it should still be there. There were posts 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the center, where the pipes and stuff was in the middle of that.
Gosh, when they lived there, there was a road where that tree sits, so it's been around quite a while.
While it's hot, before it's not. This is the Sulphur Gulch trestle, or what's left of it, and Main Street would be behind here.
Was that where that washout was? You showed the picture of that?
That's one of them, yes. Yep. And then this is just a side view looking west. Sweeping grades still remain in places between Elizabeth and ELBERT, for instance. We're near Cameron. The section house at Elizabeth, way back when, about 1915.
It was way
And in
before then.
1992.
It was way
I tried to
before
get
then.
this on the historic list. So far I've gotten thank you letters. This is all that's left of any Denver, New Orleans building is a section house at 338 Main Street in Elizabeth. This is the water tank base at ELBERT, which is just off the side of the road that goes through town. And some of the nice folks who remember the railroad are still around, like Ella Music, who at that time was 90 years old. And it's been fun getting to meet people who remember the railroad and the towns it ran through. I was at her 90th birthday and hope to be at her 96th next month. This is an ice house on the Boy Scout Ranch property at Sydney, south of ELBERT and north of Easton Ville. And this is just looking down into Easton Ville. Apex was over here, the highest point on the whole rail line, 7,263 feet. And then it went down into Easton Ville. And this is what's left of the Y at Manitou Junction. This is Highway 24. This is the Y. This is a fairly new 94 bypass. And that's my 59 Impala. And the Colorado and Southern Road still exists. The C&S Road on a portion of the old main line down near Fountain on the mailbox. Now all that's left of active track of any portion of the line that they still use is a mile down in Pueblo on Erie Avenue, where the trains run right up the middle of the street, like they have since 1881. They serve a brickyard and a beer distributor. It's hard to believe that out of a railroad that was once 124 miles long, that ran through Parker, this is all that's left. Every now and then the boys will stop off at Nick Runco's Dairy Cream to get a little treat while they're on their way up or on their way back. And this runs about 3 times a week. And that is the story, as told by me and some of the gentlemen who remember it, of life on the former Denver-New Orleans Railroad in the Shadow of the Rockies. Does anyone have any questions or comments or anything for either me or these gentlemen? Yes, Terry.
What's it, spur track?
A spur track.
Spur track, and then the signals. Do you remember any what they stood for? Or
Why, sure. I did. I was on it for about 40 years. Anyhow, at night you had to use, well, the olden days you used a hay burner, but in my time it was electric lanterns. A sign like that at night was go ahead, up and down. A sign like this was back up. Now, it doesn't make any difference in the front of the engine or the back of the engine, just what direction you happen to work. If you was working on the front end engine, well, that back up sign would be the same. If you're working on the back end and wanted to go that way ahead, you'd give them a go ahead sign. This was an easy sign across that way when you were trying to couple onto a car. And this was a stop sign. And the faster you give the stop sign, the harder you're supposed to set the brakes. If you get it real fast, you put it in emergency. That's about the only signs there was, actually the main signs. There was a lot of private signs, like this was a water sign, and once in a while we'd give them this sign.
Those who'd like to speak with these gentlemen afterwards, I'm sure they'd love to talk with you.
Would you like to see a few things I have? I have some keepsake switch locks and a few things like that, some 1893 spike, and they're all different. I'll bring them in if you'd like to see.
We have books back there for sale of all kinds from the Parker Historical Society, also the book on the Denver-New Orleans. And before we wrap up here, I'd like to have you two gentlemen stand, take some weight off my shoulders here. I'd like to present each of you with a copy of Denver and New Orleans Railroad in the Shadow of the Rockies. I think this is really special that we've gotten several gentlemen who actually worked on the railroad through Parker here to join us today and tell us their stories. I'm very grateful for you for coming. Thank you very much.
So nice of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I got the same size book as he did, and I didn't say half as much.
Yeah, but see, you're not full of that stuff.
We can cut it in half if you want.
Hi, I'm Jim Jones, and as the Beatles once said, what a long, strange trip this has been. What a great trip this has been. In a sense, my Denver-New Orleans story probably never would have happened had I not attended Lyndon State College, a small place in Vermont, Lyndonville, Vermont specifically, where Ken Langford was a fellow student and disc jockey on the campus station. Ken and I stayed in contact over the years. Ken ended up in Denver in media. Eventually, so did I, as I followed the radio dial across the country with a stop in Toledo, Ohio, halfway to my Denver dream of doing all-night radio on an AM radio station. And I did realize that dream, ended up working for a satellite company, satellite radio, after that. And during that time, thanks to Ken made the introductions to the satellite network. I ultimately met the nighttime security guard, Tom Goodson, and Tom was telling me one night, "So you like trains?" I live in an old railroad building out in Elizabeth, out on the prairie. And I asked him, where was that? And he said, well, about 30 miles from here. He said, welcome to come out sometime. I took him up on his offer, and one evening we found ourselves with a flashlight walking down the abandoned railroad grade behind the section house, went as far as the site of a trestle, which I later learned was Running Creek. Kicking cinders and railroad spikes along the way. I became very fascinated, very interested, talked with members of the local railroad club. Few had even heard of this line, and of course, being a piece of railroad obscura, it piqued my interest. I started spending more time out on the prairie and went to pancake breakfasts and joined the historical groups between Denver and Pueblo along the rail line, made a lot of wonderful friends, a lot of elderly people with great stories to tell. Some became adopted grandparents almost, and aunts and uncles to me. And I really it was just a wonderful time putting together the pieces of the Denver, New Orleans, meeting these people with their stories along with photograph contributions. I started giving programs, multi-image slide programs, up and down the abandoned railroad line and gathering more information as we went along. Thankfully, in the early 90s, Del McCoy had shown an interest in publishing this book. I had met Del as a boy when my father was having some of his New England Railroad books done by Sundance Publications of Denver, Colorado. So it was kind of neat to have pretty much have a plan all set that there was going to be a book. And this gave me the desire even more to keep going. And we did. And in 1997, for Christmas time, the book came out. 2,700 copies were printed, and Del didn't know if he was ever going to sell 2,700 copies, but okay, we'll give it a try. I made some big promises. I'll go out there on the prairie. I'll give presentations. We'll sell those books. Yeah, I sold a third of that number, and Del was able to sell the rest. And it's a shame that there wasn't a second printing, but that was never in the cards. As a result, eBay prices now for used copies are through the wall, through the ceiling, through the stratosphere. I've seen copies for well over $200 when the cover price was originally $45. So it got me to thinking as I was invited to participate, in fact, host the 80th anniversary of the ELBERT flood in May of 2015, that we put together a nice little 60-minute documentary with a bunch of extra bonus features, and to offer this at a very affordable price for people who either have the book and want a video version, or who wish they could have the book but can't afford it, or maybe just people with a casual interest in the subject. This is probably a good place to start or finish, depending on your perspective. So I certainly hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Hopefully you'll look at some of our other products as well. ColoradoRailVideos.com. That's ColoradoRailVideos.com. As I was doing the Denver, New Orleans subject, it got me to thinking there's a lot of railroads that are endangered, that aren't getting covered. And I started going out with my video camera and getting to know the railroad people and getting to know the schedules, especially of the more obscure lines, and videotaping them for posterity. And we're now putting together programs similar to this, available for your purchasing and perusal as well. Thanks a lot for coming along for the ride. Enjoyed having you.